There are moments in American history when the people trusted to protect the country quietly turn their power against it, and right now, we may be living through one of those moments. In the span of a single day, something happened in Washington that sent shockwaves through newsrooms, courtrooms, and the halls of Congress. The FBI, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the United States, was reportedly using its full investigative machinery not to chase terrorists, not to stop crime, not to protect the American people, but to go after a journalist. A reporter who had done nothing more than her job, who had spoken to sources, asked hard questions, and written a story that made one very powerful man very uncomfortable. At the same time, across the country in Virginia, federal agents in full tactical gear were raiding the office of a Democratic state senator. Cameras were rolling. And here is the part that nobody could explain. Fox News was already there, ready, waiting. 3 hours from their own offices. And then there was the other story. The one that had been building for months, about a cabinet member. A man sitting inside Trump's inner circle, whose connections to one of the most notorious figures in modern American history were slowly, painfully coming back to the surface. Howard Lutnik, Jeffrey Epstein, and a timeline that kept changing every time someone asked the right question. 3 stories, 1 day, and they were all connected. But what happened behind those closed doors that morning was only the beginning. Let's start with Howard Lutnik, because his story is the one that had been quietly building the longest. Lutnik is not just any name in Washington. He is the United States Secretary of Commerce, a man sitting at the highest table of American power, appointed by Donald Trump, confirmed by the Senate, trusted with the economic future of the country. But on this particular morning, none of that mattered as much as one question. What exactly was his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? And why did his answers keep changing? The House Oversight Committee had been circling this question for months, and today was the day they finally got him in a room. The transcribed interview began at around 11:15 in the morning, behind closed doors, away from cameras, away from the public. A small group of lawmakers, only about 6 members of Congress, were present, because this was happening during a congressional recess week. But the people who were there had been waiting a long time for this moment, because Lutnik's story had already shifted dramatically, and everyone in that room knew it. He had once told the New York Post that he was never in a room with Epstein, not socially, not for business, not for anything. He had said, and these are close to his own words, that if that man was there, he simply would not go, because the man disgusted him. Strong words, clear words, the kind of words that sound like a closed door. But then the details started surfacing. A 2012 visit to Epstein's private island, his wife, his 4 children, the nannies, plural, a family trip to that island. And it did not stop there. Emails continued between people in Lutnik's circle and people in Epstein's circle all the way through 2018. A shared investment in a company called Adfin, and a 2015 fundraiser for Hillary Clinton, where Lutnik had personally invited Jeffrey Epstein. Each new detail landed like a quiet explosion. Because it was not just that the story was inconsistent, it was that the inconsistencies followed a pattern. A pattern of someone who said one thing publicly, while the paper trail quietly told another story. And when lawmakers had pressed him on this in earlier hearings, when they had asked him directly why he had misrepresented his relationship to the press, his answer had been to dodge, to reclaim time, to promise he would explain it all later. Today was later. And somewhere in that room, behind closed doors, the questions were finally being asked face to face. But even as that interview was unfolding, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with Epstein, and yet felt connected to the exact same current running through American politics right now. A current about power, about who gets protected and who gets targeted. Because on this same morning, in a completely different part of the country, another kind of door was being forced open. Not in a hearing room, not with questions, but with federal agents, tactical gear, long guns, and a Fox News camera crew that somehow, impossibly, was already on the scene. And that is when things started to escalate in a way that few people had seen coming. The raid on Louise Lucas's office did not happen quietly. It happened loudly, visibly, and with maximum force. Federal agents moved through Portsmouth, Virginia in tactical gear, carrying long weapons, executing search warrants across multiple locations connected to the Democratic state senator. And if you were watching the news that morning, you already knew something was off, because Fox News was there. Not arriving late, not catching the tail end, but already positioned, already filming, already broadcasting as the raid began. Portsmouth, Virginia is roughly 200 miles from Washington, D.C., a 3-hour drive. And yet somehow, a Fox News crew was ready and waiting. The FBI has not explained how that happened. Nobody has explained how that happened. And that silence itself tells a story. Louise Lucas is not a minor figure. She is the Speaker of the Virginia State Senate, a woman who grew up under Jim Crow, who became the second woman of color to serve in that chamber, and who in the weeks before this raid had done something that put her directly in Donald Trump's crosshairs. She had led the effort to redraw Virginia's congressional districts, a redistricting push that could hand Democrats as many as 4 additional seats heading into the midterms. Trump had publicly demanded 5 new seats. He had called them seats he was entitled to. And Lucas had looked that demand in the eye and refused. So when the FBI showed up at her office with tactical teams and search warrants, the question was not simply whether there was a valid investigation. The question was whether anyone could still look at this Justice Department, this FBI, and honestly believe that the timing was a coincidence. The official explanation was that this raid was connected to a years-long corruption investigation involving Lucas and a series of local cannabis dispensaries in Virginia, an investigation that had reportedly started under the Biden administration. But here is what made people stop and think. No charges had been filed in 3 years. 3 years of investigation. And then, weeks after Louise Lucas successfully led a redistricting effort that directly threatened Republican control of Congress, the raid happened. And Fox News was already there to film it. A source familiar with the matter told reporters that Trump's former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia had believed that bringing a bribery case against a prominent Democrat before the midterms would be, in his words, good for the White House. Good for the White House. Not good for justice. Not warranted by the evidence. Good for the White House. And other prosecutors in that same office were not even sure the case was strong enough to bring. Virginia's own Attorney General responded carefully, saying that several previous actions from that U.S. Attorney's office had already undermined public confidence. He urged restraint. But restraint felt difficult in a moment like this, because this was not happening in isolation. It was happening on the same day that the FBI was reportedly investigating a journalist for writing an unflattering story about the FBI director. And it was happening against a backdrop of something even larger. A list that had been growing for months, a list of names. People who had been investigated, charged, targeted, or pressured by the Justice Department under this administration. Former FBI Director James Comey, former CIA Director John Brennan, New York Attorney General Letitia James, Senator Mark Kelly, Senator Alyssa Slotkin, multiple sitting members of Congress, the Federal Reserve Chair, the Federal Reserve Governor, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, Minnesota's governor, multiple mayors, multiple state attorneys general. The list was not a coincidence. The list was a pattern, and the pattern had a name. Now let's talk about Kash Patel, because his story is the one that ties everything together. Kash Patel became the director of the FBI with almost no traditional credentials for the job, no senior law enforcement experience, no background that would typically qualify someone to lead the most powerful investigative agency in the world. But he had something else. He had Donald Trump's trust, and he had a reputation for personal loyalty and a willingness to act on it. What followed his appointment was a series of decisions that alarmed career agents, legal experts, and journalists alike. He transferred hundreds of FBI personnel, more than 500 people, out of Washington and into Huntsville, Alabama. The stated reason was to slim down headquarters and put more people in the field. But the practical effect was to remove experienced agents from the center of power and scatter them far from the oversight structures that had kept the Bureau in check for decades. Then came the story, the one that started everything. Sarah Fitzpatrick, a senior investigative reporter for The Atlantic, spent weeks speaking to more than 24 sources inside and outside the FBI. What they told her was extraordinary. That Kash Patel frequently disappeared from his duties without explanation. That he drank heavily, including during working hours, that members of his own security detail had difficulty waking him on multiple occasions because he appeared to be intoxicated, that a request had actually been made for breaching equipment, the kind normally used by SWAT teams to force entry into locked buildings, because Patel had been unreachable behind locked doors at a time when he was supposed to be on duty. The Atlantic published the story. It included Patel's blanket denial. And then it stood by every word, saying that even after publication, More sources had come forward to corroborate what had already been reported. Patel's response was to sue a $250 million defamation lawsuit against The Atlantic and against Fitzpatrick personally. Legal experts who read the filing noted that it was riddled with typos and errors. They called it rushed. They called it an obvious pressure tactic rather than a serious legal action. But it did not stop there. Because today, on this same extraordinary day, MS Now reporters Carol Lonig and Ken Delanian broke a new story. The FBI had quietly opened what it was calling an insider threat investigation into Sarah Fitzpatrick. Not because she had leaked classified information, not because she had broken any law, but because she had written a story that made Kash Patel look bad. Agents in Huntsville, Alabama, Patel's newly relocated unit, had reportedly been given instructions from the executive suite to review Fitzpatrick's social media contacts, her communications, her connections to sources. The investigation could potentially be used to compel phone companies and internet providers to hand over her metadata. It could be used to run her name through FBI databases. It could expose every source who had ever spoken to her. And the agents assigned to carry it out were deeply uncomfortable. One of them told a reporter, and these words are chilling in their simplicity, they know they are not supposed to do this, but if they don't go forward, they could lose their jobs. You are damned if you do and damned if you don't. Think about what that means. Career law enforcement professionals, people who had dedicated their lives to upholding the law, were now being placed in a position where following orders meant violating the principles they had sworn to protect. And refusing orders meant losing their livelihoods. The FBI spokesperson publicly denied the investigation even existed, but two sources with direct knowledge told reporters otherwise. And then there was this detail that pushed the whole situation into a different kind of territory. This was not the first time. Just weeks earlier, the New York Times had reported that the FBI had opened a criminal stalking probe into one of its own reporters. The reason? That reporter had written a story about Kash Patel's girlfriend. Patel had defended that investigation by saying the story had put his girlfriend's life in danger. But legal experts and press freedom advocates looked at that explanation and found it hollow. The Times called it exactly what it appeared to be, an attempt to criminalize routine news gathering, protected by the First Amendment, pursued anyway. And now it was happening again. This time to The Atlantic. This time to Sarah Fitzpatrick, who, even in the middle of a defamation lawsuit and a potential criminal investigation, published yet another story on this very same day. This one was about bourbon. Kash Patel bourbon, to be specific. 8 sources, including current and former FBI and Justice Department officials, told Fitzpatrick that Patel regularly traveled with personalized, branded bottles of whiskey. 750-milliliter bottles engraved with his name, his title, and the official seal of the FBI. Some bottles had his signature on them, followed by the number 9, because he is the 9th director in FBI history. He had given these bottles to FBI staff. He had given them to civilians he encountered during official business. He had reportedly used Justice Department aircraft to transport cases of them. When The Atlantic asked the FBI about this, the spokesperson did not deny it. Instead, they called it a tradition. They said it fell within the Bureau's ethical guidelines. But when Fitzpatrick tried to verify that claim, it fell apart almost immediately. The FBI refused to provide images of any bottles bearing the names of previous directors. And when a former senior FBI official was asked whether he had ever seen personally branded liquor bottles distributed by any past director of the Bureau, he burst out laughing, because it had never happened before. It was not a tradition. It was something else entirely. A former FBI agent put it plainly. The bottles are demoralizing, they said, because they suggest one standard for the director and an entirely different standard for everyone else. And the lawyer for a former assistant director of the FBI's Washington field office went further. There are line agents, he said, spending their nights and weekends writing warrants and planning arrests. And the FBI director apparently has time to design personal logos, attend hockey games, and sit for multi-hour podcast interviews. This, he said, is one of the most serious jobs in the country, not a platform for self-promotion, not a branding exercise. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. On one side, federal agents in tactical gear raiding the office of a Democratic lawmaker who had defied Trump. On another side, a journalist being investigated for writing an unflattering profile of the FBI's own director. And on yet another side, a MAGA congressman named Andy Ogles, who had lied about donating $320,000 to his own campaign, whose phone had been seized by the FBI in late 2024, and whose investigation had quietly collapsed just 11 days after Trump took office. 11 days. The career prosecutors had withdrawn. The case had been handed up to Maine Justice in Washington. And Ogles, who in the meantime had introduced a bill to let Trump buy Greenland, nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, and proposed a constitutional amendment to allow Trump a third term, was now walking free with the investigation effectively buried. If there was still any doubt about what was happening, former President Barack Obama appeared on television the night before and said something that stopped people mid-sentence. "We can survive bad policy," he said. "We can overcome a lot. But we cannot overcome the politicization of the criminal justice system. Because when whoever is in charge of the government starts using the power of the state to go after their political enemies and reward their friends, something fundamental breaks. Something that is very hard to put back together." And just when it seemed like the full picture was becoming clear, one more thread was still being pulled. Back behind those closed doors in Washington, Howard Lutnik was still answering questions. Or not answering them. The committee had waited months for this moment. They had watched his story shift from total denial to partial admission. They had seen the emails. They had seen the timeline. They had seen the invitation to Epstein Island, the family trip that followed, and the business ties that continued long after Lutnik had publicly claimed the relationship was over. And now, with a room full of lawmakers and a transcript being recorded word for word, the questions were finally coming. But the answers, whatever they were going to be, were still locked behind that door. And somewhere in the space between what Lutnik had said publicly and what the evidence was showing privately, there was a truth that this investigation had been chasing for a very long time. And just when it seemed like that truth was finally within reach, the door finally opened. The transcribed interview with Howard Lutnik had concluded, and the details that began filtering out were exactly as complicated as everyone had expected. Because this was not a simple story of a man who had forgotten a name or mixed up a date. This was a pattern, a long, documented, carefully traceable pattern of a man who had said one thing in public while the evidence quietly pointed somewhere else entirely. Lutnik had told the committee that receiving the invitation to visit Epstein Island had felt unsettling. His word, unsettling. And yet, he had taken his wife, his 4 children, and multiple nannies and gone anyway. He had looked at something that made him uncomfortable, something he had already described as gross, and he had walked toward it. And then, he had not told anyone. He had not warned people in his social circle. He had not distanced himself publicly. He had continued the emails. He had continued the shared investments. He had invited Epstein to a political fundraiser as recently as 2015, a fundraiser for a presidential candidate. And through all of it, his public story had remained one of disgust and distance. The gap between those two things, between what he said and what he did, was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was documented. It was in the emails. It was in the calendar records. It was in the testimony being captured word for word in that room. And the lawmakers who had been waiting months for this moment now had it all on the record. But here is what made this climax so much bigger than just one man's testimony. Because on the very same day that Lutnik was finally being questioned under oath, the FBI was investigating a journalist for writing the truth about its own director. On the same day that federal agents in tactical gear were raiding the office of a Democratic lawmaker who had stood up to the president. On the same day that a MAGA congressman's campaign finance investigation was quietly being buried. On the same day that personalized bourbon bottles with an FBI seal were being confirmed as real, as documented, as something that had actually happened inside America's chief law enforcement agency. All of it was happening at once, and the weight of that, the sheer accumulated weight of it, was becoming impossible to carry casually. This was not chaos. Chaos is random. This had a direction. Kara Lutnik, one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country, sat in front of the camera and said clearly that what was happening to Sarah Fitzpatrick was something she had never seen before in her career. That opening a criminal leak investigation not tied to classified information, not tied to any actual crime, But tied directly to an unflattering profile of the man running the investigation was a line that had never been crossed this openly before. And inside the FBI, agents who had spent careers following rules, who had internalized the idea that the Bureau existed to serve the law and not any individual, were now being asked to cross that line or lose their jobs. One former FBI official put it in terms that were simple and devastating. If the FBI starts doing things that are not based on an actual threat to national security or a genuine violation of the law, he said, then it has become something else. It has become a secret police force. Those words landed hard because they were not coming from a political opponent. They were coming from someone who had spent years inside the institution. Someone who understood exactly what it meant when an agency of that power began turning inward, began protecting its leadership instead of protecting the public. And Barack Obama's warning from the night before was now echoing louder. You cannot have a situation, he had said, where whoever controls the government uses that control to punish enemies and protect friends. That is not a policy disagreement. That is not a difference of political opinion. That is something structural. Something that, once broken, does not simply repair itself after the next election. And now, here was the evidence, laid out across a single day, across multiple stories, across multiple institutions, all pointing in the same direction. The consequences of all of this were still unfolding. Sarah Fitzpatrick was still being investigated. Louise was still facing federal scrutiny. Howard Lutnik's transcript was still being reviewed. And Patel was still sitting in his office, presumably with a bottle of personalized bourbon nearby. But what followed next, what this day was going to mean for the press, for the courts, for every person watching these institutions either hold or collapse, was far from over. What does it mean when the institutions built to protect a democracy begin to move against it? That is not a hypothetical question anymore. That is the question this day forced onto the table. Because when you step back and look at everything that happened, not as separate stories, not as isolated headlines, but as a single picture, what you see is a system under deliberate pressure. Sarah Fitzpatrick did not stop reporting, even while being sued for $250 million. Even while a criminal investigation was reportedly being built around her sources and her contacts, she published again. That takes something that most people will never be asked to find in themselves. And the sources who kept coming forward to talk to her, the FBI agents and former officials who knew what it could cost them, who understood that polygraphs were being deployed inside the Bureau in ways that had never happened before, they kept talking anyway, because they believed the public had a right to know. Louise stood outside her raided office and said she was not afraid. She had not been afraid of Donald Trump before, and she was not going to start now. An 82-year-old woman who had lived through Jim Crow, who had spent decades building power through service and sacrifice, was not going to be silenced by tactical gear and television cameras. And the lawmakers inside that hearing room, the ones who had waited months to sit across from Howard Lutnik and ask their questions, they now had a transcript, words on the record, a timeline that could be examined, challenged, and pursued. The truth, whatever its full shape turns out to be, was no longer locked behind a closed door. What this day revealed was not just the actions of a few individuals. It revealed how much pressure American institutions can absorb before they either hold or break. The FBI agents who raised concerns internally, the journalists who refused to be intimidated, the elected officials who pushed back despite the risk, they are the reason this story exists at all. They are the reason any of this is visible. Barack Obama said we can survive a lot. Bad policy, difficult elections, complicated moments. But we cannot survive the weaponization of the justice system. We cannot survive a government that uses the law as a personal tool. And what this single day showed with painful clarity is that the fight to prevent exactly that is not coming. It is already here. It is happening right now. In courtrooms and newsrooms and hearing rooms and on the streets of Portsmouth, Virginia. And it is going to take people who are paying attention to matter. So if this story made you think, if it made you feel something, if you believe that what happens to the press and to the truth and to the institutions that hold this country together actually matters, then stay engaged. Share this. Talk about it. Leave your thoughts in the comments because this conversation is one that cannot afford to go quiet. And if you want to stay informed as this story continues to develop, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us, because this is far from the last chapter.